What, if anything, can or should the Brooklyn Nets do with Ben Simmons? Are we looking at a lost season? Are we looking at a lost just timeline for this situation in general? Is there anything that can salvage what's happening on the court with Ben Simmons this season or going forward? We're going to break it all down right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, sitting here solo for Wednesday's podcast. No Adam Armbrecht. That dude put in some heavy lifting around the trade deadline, taking a much-deserved little in-week break following the loss to the Knicks. That's okay. We're going to roll this one solo. Plenty to talk about. I'm the owner of DFSR.com, by the way. If you need some projections for FanDuel or DraftKings, go check over at DFSR.com. Got you covered over there. Appreciate you making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. Here to let you know today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com. Promo code LOCKEDON. All right. Wednesday, Brooklyn Nets. Here we go. Ben Simmons. It didn't take long after the Knicks game for Ben Simmons to become another national talking point for what was happening with his game on the court. I mean, and then by extension, maybe off the court as well. And one would have thought maybe, the Kevin Durant trade out of Brooklyn would have just started to alleviate the pressure. Kyrie Irving being traded would alleviate the pressure from the Ben Simmons situation. The team's no longer championship contenders. The timeline and the trajectory of the team are just totally different now. Maybe we're looking at a situation where Ben Simmons could start to maybe thrive again. Look, there were times during this season where that was clearly the case. It looked like a decent fit alongside KD and Kyrie, and the team was, reeling off wins. There was a time in the season where things were starting to look good, but it hasn't taken long post-trade deadline to start to get an idea of what is happening or not happening with Ben Simmons on the Brooklyn Nets. It came out a little in the post game. Jacque Vaughn had some quotes that we'll get into, shortly about what he said about the Ben Simmons situation here in Brooklyn. And like I said before, it's become something of a national talking point now where some of the big players in the media world are beginning to talk, and maybe this is the last sort of talking hurrah about Ben Simmons and his game and what's kind of not been happening. Did make some of the rounds about what's happening here, and the situation could be headed for possibly, a basketball tragic ending. Not a real life tragic ending, but in a basketball parlance, like we could be headed for something really bad. And that's because what's happened sort of after the trade deadline and with this new group of players that the Nets brought in from the Kyrie Irving trade and from the Kevin Durant trade, Ben Simmons has not been part of this plan even a little bit. In the last two games, he's played 16 minutes. He played 16 minutes against Philly. We'll go all the way back to the 7th, because that's where he comes back from injury. They play Phoenix on the 7th. He plays 27 minutes, scores 2 points, 6 assists, 4 rebounds. Then on the 9th, they play Chicago. He plays 20 minutes. He goes for 8 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists. Now, when we start talking like real after the trade stuff, this is Saturday where they start to get the full look team for the first time in Philadelphia. This is when Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson make their first starts. Simmons plays 16 minutes, scores 4 points, 3 assists, 3 rebounds. And then Knicks on Monday, he plays 13 minutes, 2 points, 3 rebounds, 2 assists, takes 2 shots. And this is where the conversation starts to happen. We're seeing a clear downward, move in terms of his minutes. Jacque Vaughn has been asked specifically about what it's going to look like going forward. And now we are in a situation where we have to just really start thinking about the long-term ramifications of having Ben Simmons sort of on the team and what it means for him to even be on the team, because this is headed in completely the wrong direction. And if you Look, at this point, I hate to pick on Simmons in the sense that, like, it's very, very obvious what's happening. You don't need to watch much of the basketball game to know that what's happening on the court, at least in its current iteration, is not good. This is not the Ben Simmons of old. It's very, very far removed from that. Yes, he's, a few months from post back surgery. I think that's definitely a part of it. I think there's other sort of probably, mental aspects of the game and what he does and doesn't want to do that is also part of it. And it's becoming more of a talking point. And things become a talking point of a guy like Simmons when you factor in money. Like, this is always the discussion. Always the we have to ground ourselves in contracts and money when we talk about talent in the NBA to some degree, because there's sort of finite resources that a team can spend on players. If an outsized amount of money is locked into one player and that player's not playing anywhere close to the actual contract, then that's going to be a major discussion point because it inhibits what the team can do elsewhere on the roster. When $35 million is applied to Ben Simmons, in terms of the overall salary cap this season, of the 157 million that the Nets have spent, 35 is going to Ben Simmons. Next year, it's going to be 37, really 38 million. And then 2024, 2025, it's going to be north of 40 million. This is why we talk about Simmons. If the money wasn't attached, there's two things that are true. One, Simmons would not be playing at all. I think that's very, very clear. There's been multiple examples of just, if any other player did some of these things on the court, it would be a pretty easy hook for that player. Like, I think that that's not a hot take. I think that, to some degree, especially recently, because he's Ben Simmons and not because he's Ben Simmons, the basketball player, is where those minutes have even come from. Like, we saw a few examples of this even in the Knicks, right? Like, and I hate to go like tape stuff here because there are enough examples, but passed up an open dunk when he had Claxton sitting in the dunker spot, one of those head scratching moments where he clearly doesn't want to shoot. Short armed the ball near the rim on a turnaround. Okay, it happens. He's still kind of like trying to figure things out. I thought the worst one was he had a rebound, had what was a smart outlet pass to Royce O'Neal. I think it was Royce O'Neal, who was on the break. The ball didn't quite get there. Okay, the aggressiveness was good. Josh Hart intercepted it. The problem was what happened next is that Hart comes down and Simmons, who is not the only one who's to blame here, but was the closest to the basket when it happens, is basically Matador's defense, and Hart just goes right through the rest of the team like a knife through warm butter and dunks the ball, effectively ending the game, though the game was over to that degree. So when things are showing up on film that are very, very damning, when you have the money as it is, where it is with Simmons as it is right now, and you have the minutes on a decline, yeah, this is going to be a story. And whatever the reasoning or what's happening with Simmons, what the reasons are for it. Again, if he was a $2 million a year player, we would not be having this discussion. It would be over. He wouldn't be playing. They would just go and find other solutions out here. It's because you look at the past situation with Simmons, in what he had been in the past, and plenty of videos have made the rounds in the Twitter sphere today of just sort of old highlight reels, wondering sort of what's happened to him. When you combine the old version of that, plus the money, plus like the dream on maybe what the upside could be in the future, yeah, you are going to end up talking about Simmons. And the Nets are in an impossible spot here. The Nets are in a really, really tough spot about what to do. We'll go through some of the options here in a second. We'll also look at just kind of refresh ourselves on some of his numbers as well going forward, and make some predictions about sort of like maybe how the rest of this plays out for the rest of the season. But as of right now, the Ben Simmons situation is looking pretty grim in Nets land. Going to get into all the rest of that in a second. But first, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. All you're doing on Prize Picks is you're making entries. You're going more or less on their player projections. You pile those together and you can win some real money. Prize Picks has figured this out. They want to make it really easy for you. They don't want you wrestling with salaries. They don't want you wrestling with just like other sharks in the water that are out to kind of pick you off because of the algorithms and stuff like that. No. All you're doing on Prize Picks, you're picking 2 to 6 players. You're figuring out if they're going to score more or less than their Prize Picks projection and you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry, not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections. If you're in the NBA, you can do a couple things. You can either just go more or less on the points, more or less on the assists, more or less on the rebounds, but you can also kind of pile those together. You can find a player, this one's going to be a little dated by the time you hear this, but you have right now where you can go Giannis 52 more points plus rebounds plus assists in the game against Boston without Jason Tatum. I like that one. Let's see how that one holds up. Derek White, same kind of thing. No Jason Tatum, no Jaylen Brown, 31.5 more points plus rebounds plus assists. Let's see how those ones hold up when we check in on the podcast later. Go over to Prize Picks. You download the app or you go to prizepicks.com. Your first-time users are going to receive 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. If you deposit 100, Prize Picks will give you 100. Deposit 50, Prize Picks will give you 50. Don't forget to enter promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. All right, some of the other stuff that we got going with Simmons here, we'll break down, look at a little bit at the numbers, although, you know how this goes, and this has kind of been the story all season. We know the usage rate is in the toilet. We know that some of this stuff has kind of gone for him. We know that there were times where this was looking okay as a complementary piece to KD and Kyrie, although, it's not that hard to be a complementary piece to guys with that skill set because the pressure and the burden of talent is significantly taken off anyone that plays in lineups with those guys because they're just so good. That being said, the combination of those three did look good at times. They went on a nice little, really great run in the middle of the season where it looked like, this team was headed on the championship path. We know that it's been completely and utterly dumpstered since then, but there was a time when this was looking okay and where Simmons's game and the deficiencies in his game weren't as glaring. Because again, when you share the court with those superstars, the lift is going to be much, much lower. But look, we go back to December and he was, averaging 25 minutes a game, 6 rebounds, 6 assists, a little north of 7.5 points. That's low. He went through a double-digit scoring run in November where he was 20, 14, 11, 22, 15, 11. And you're kind of thinking, okay, we can get to this. It's so easy to forget now, but you go back to Memphis back on November 20th, played 35 minutes, dropped 22, 8, and 5. The game before he was 15, 13, and 7 against Portland. If you remember that win on the road against Portland, which was a nice, that might've been the Royce O'Neal buzzer beater where they won. But so we're going through this time where things are looking good. The problem with Simmons is, and sometimes this is like how you had to treat a lot of the Nets, just history in general, is that you get stuck looking in the past too much. And it's very difficult to remember some of that stuff because what's happening in the present looks really, really rough. And if we believe it's just a back issue and we believe it's just, still working back to getting the back and the knees and everything right, there is a world where you can, I think, and you have to really squint, but I think you can talk yourself into it. Now, the Nets might be in a situation where they have to talk themselves into this situation because, they're just kind of stuck here. The problem is that the Nets aren't even trying to talk themselves into it at this point, right? So even if there was a world where we could maybe still dream on some of the upsides, still dream on the fit with Simmons plus spacers, right? Like Simmons plus Dinwiddie plus Mikal Bridges, maybe you want to throw Cam Thomas in there, Joe Harris, they have Seth Curry, they have other spacers. Yeah, there would be some defensive problems. Maybe you see DFS as being able to hit enough 3-pointers around him as well. You're like, okay, Simmons plus some wings, maybe one on ball creator, will get out into the open floor, really cause some havoc on defense. I can see it. I think there's a world where that kind of lineup could make sense, not on a championship team, but on a kind of see what you have team. I think you could talk yourself into it. So you can talk yourself into that. You can look back at some of the past numbers and say, okay, I can sort of see it. The problem is the Nets are not doing that themselves right now, as evidenced by what's happened recently with these minutes and with Jacque Vaughn kind of just being asked directly about it and talking about the now challenges of playing Simmons. And I don't know if this is a retroactive piece, what Vaughn said around just trying to explain it, or laying the groundwork for you're not part of the future. And we don't really want to see what else is happening here, because with the Simmons discussion, especially where Vaughn is concerned, and he's the sort of the mouthpiece of what's happening organizationally. Vaughn did say, quote, you put another big next to Ben, then you have to figure out what the spacing is around him. Then if you put another playmaker next to him, you have to figure out what Ben looks like without the basketball. He's getting specific into like sort of the problem areas of trying to play Simmons with some of the other talent that they have. Now, you say to yourself, well, he's the coach. It's his job to figure it out. I would agree with that. Like, it is Jacque Vaughn's. If you are believing in the Ben Simmons experiment and you're believing in what Simmons has sort of upside, or what he still possibly has in any bag that exists for him now, then it is on the coach to try to figure out what those, situations look like. And I would say the Nets have a team now where there should be kind of patience around that if they are realistic about what the ultimate goals are here. Like, are they a championship team now? No. Are they a team that could win a first round playoff series? Unlikely. So at that point, in some ways, I would like to hear this quote a little differently from Jacque Vaughn and say, hey, we'll live with some of the downside to try to get this guy back into the mix and back doing what it is that he does really well. When he says quotes like this about how hard it is to find fits for Simmons, and we've heard about some of the frustrations that he had said, or some of the conversations that Vaughn had talked about beforehand, before this quote, where he had said something along the lines of, in the future, he'll just appreciate that I'm honest with him, which is like code word for, we had a really hard conversation that Ben Simmons did not like, related to how much or little he was going to be playing going forward. And so not only are they not saying these things, and they're not putting anything like this into practice, at least in the short term, there's no mention of really the injury being an issue here. Like, there's other opportunities to say, hey, we're working back from injury. We're still, the knees and the back, and this is what we're working on. There are other opportunities to sort of put lipstick on the pig to some degree and say, well, these are the reasons that, the situation is working out. But there's no effort to even do that. The effort is gone from even what possibly could be the reasons that Simmons is no longer on the court. It was really just like, he doesn't fit. It's not working. He's got to hear it. We're going with other guys. And that's kind of what we're doing going forward. And if you're a Nets fan, like, this is really tough to hear, because what this really sounds like, and what this is starting to look like, is we've given up. Like, we, the team, we, the organization, have given up on trying to fix this, whatever the reason, whether it's like he doesn't want to take the coaching, or like the skill set's just too far behind, or he's just so far behind in his game right now, or it's just like, we just want to see what other guys, can do. Like, this does sound very much like an organization that is beginning to move on from Ben Simmons. And that is gonna look pretty weird. Like, that's going to really might be and look, things change, man. This team was a championship contender 2 months ago, and we were doing complete and utter victory laps of how great they were. And now Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are gone, and it's all starting over. So I'm totally in the world where, this stuff can just change, right? Like, 2 back-to-back great games, and he's right back in the lineup, and we're singing a totally different tune. But it is starting to very much sound like the organization could be just either not loving the long-term prospects and the short-term prospects, seeing this situation as maybe unsalvageable. I'm putting words in their mouth. They did not say that, but I'm just kind of going off what some of the feel we got going on here is. Or possibly looking to try to trade for 10 cents on the dollar, if that was even possible in the offseason. Which, a few little rumors kind of trickled out around whether or not that was even a possibility. The situation is gearing up to be possibly ugly. I don't know if we're looking at a repeat of the Philly situation. It's definitely on the table. And the reason I say that is because it already happened once. And when something happens once, you can at least put it on the table that it could happen again. But we're looking at that kind of situation, and we'll talk about this in a second, but it does get a little complicated with what the options are, even with, best or worst case scenario with Ben Simmons going forward. Before we get into that, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and all the calories, you have to try Built Bar. Look, we're post holidays. We're trying to set goals. We're trying to eat right. We're trying to get healthy snacks, healthier, just in general. Built Bar is there to help you with the protein bar that actually tastes good. This is what they figured out compared to the competitors. They focus on the taste. They cover these things in 100% real chocolate, and they backed it up with the stats. If you want the flavors, churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. If you want the stats, 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, just a whopping 17 grams of protein. Don't want to undersell that. You can find them at built.com. You can also find them at Walmart, find them at Sam's Club. Pick up a 4-box of the cookies and cream, grab the double chocolate, grab the coconut puffs. Like I said, head on over to Sam's Club, head on over to Walmart, or go to built.com and you'll thank me later. All right, what are the options for Ben Simmons moving forward here? This situation, if it were not to resolve and we were not to kind of figure out that Ben Simmons could start playing like even 70% of the old Ben Simmons, if it continues on this trajectory and it's not health related, like what are the options for the Nets? I already went over the contract. It's the contract where it stands now. Just to reiterate, $35.5 million this year. This season's a wash. He's going to be on the team the rest of the year. $38 million next year, $40.3 million in 2024 and 25. There were reports that the Nets would consider thinking about a trade for him in the offseason. I actually don't even know what that would look like. Like, if you want to find comparable contracts that were albatrosses for the team, that the guy was currently on. We've seen many examples of this in the past. Most recently, obviously, Russell Westbrook was this, where the Lakers were going to have to attach a pretty nice asset, at least, in an unprotected first round pick, possibly more, depending on who they were trying to get back, just to get Russ Westbrook out the door, which they effectively did. And then who knows, as of right now, I don't think they've actually figured out what his role, if any, or if he's going to get bought out, what's going to be happening in Utah. These contracts cannot be traded. Like these contracts, I mean, I guess they can, but think about other contracts that were sort of negative value for the team when you ranged up to this amount of money. Kevin Love comes to mind, right? Like we talked forever about Kevin Love going to get traded. The contract was crazy. Like it was kind of done in that post-championship run with LeBron. And then LeBron leaves, and all of a sudden that contract looks, super dicey. He's on his last year of it now, $29 million. He's on the bench with the Cavs. They never traded him. And, how actively they were trying to do it, it's unclear. But I think there were times when those calls were definitely put in to see if they could get off that money in any way, shape, or form. And they just weren't able to. So we've seen examples of these contracts in the past. They are very, very difficult to move. You're going to have to attach assets if the player is, not performing anywhere close to the actual dollar number. Then the team, in this case, the Nets, would be forced to attach some possibly significant assets to get Ben Simmons off the books. And, what team at this point wants to get into business with Ben Simmons for 2 years at this kind of money? My guess is none of them, right? Like even on like a reclamation project, a young team, I would say probably at this point, most young teams probably just like sort of like the core that they're building with, right? If you look at Orlando, they have to like what they have, Apollo and Franz and these guys. Houston, okay, you can talking yourself into the Jalen Green Şengün era, right? Like going forward, okay. OKC clearly with Shea and Giddey and the guys that they have over there. So like young teams who might want to take a flyer, have some cap room, then, you can talk yourself into it. Spurs. Does Ben Simmons strike you as a Spurs guy? He doesn't to me. Like it's not like they have some great young core. They have Keldon Johnson. Maybe you like Trey Jones. But like, do you see, a team like the Spurs coming in and saying, hey, we'll take it for, 50 cents on the dollar if we can even match the contracts, which would be nearly impossible. Like, does that strike you as a situation that looks, reasonable? It doesn't really to me. And now all of a sudden you start running out of teams because that would even consider it. And I don't even think those teams would consider it. But any team that has playoff aspirations, let's say, is not going to want to tie $30+ million, $40 million to their books on the hope that they're able to figure out something that two teams have not really been able to figure out now in Philly and Brooklyn. So is trading him even a reasonable thing? I fail to see it. The other part of this too is really the only way to reclaim some of the trade value is to actually have him play and play well. And they don't seem to want to do that. So if you're not going to want to have him play and you're not going to at least have him go out there and show like, hey, let's get 2 months of good basketball, get to the hoop, let's play high volume transition stuff. Let's get after on defense, get out there all the time, 30 minutes a game. Who cares if we win or lose? Like, you just try to get yourself back to normal. It doesn't look like they're planning to do that. So now there's a chance that you're left with a version of Simmons, which is the last thing people saw, which is like what just has happened over the last couple of games with him. And that's what's going to last in people's memory. Again, I went back to those December and November timelines. Nobody remembers that. Like, we watch the Nets every single day. Even I had trouble remembering that because sometimes what have you done for me lately is a core tenet in following sports. And believe me, other teams, even the ones that have steady hands around this and can really see the forest for the trees, will struggle to see like any potential value here. So even the part where the Nets could actually get back to normal with him, if they're not going to be willing to do that, then I don't know what the situation here. I don't think a buyout is anywhere on the table. Someone mentioned this the other day, and to buy out a player, like the player has to agree to a buyout. Why would Ben Simmons agree to a buyout? He's going to get paid. He's going to get paid his money, which I'm not telling him to do that, by the way. I think players should just get the money that they're in their contract. So I'm not even suggesting that that's a move that anyone should consider, like on the player side. But these are like the only options. There is a reason these guys with the bad contracts stick with the teams through the end of the contracts, because that is the only option. There are no other options. So I think in totality, we're looking at 3 options here with Ben Simmons. The first option is he becomes a role player for this team, plays 15 minutes a game, doesn't say a word, gets happy with with that role. And that's just kind of how they move forward. And they try to just kick this can down the road a season or two. I think that's one version of what can happen. There's another version where he Phillies this thing and, says, this is not what I want to do. I don't think it's likely, but again, he's done it once. It's on the table. When you've done it once, it's on the table. No indication that's going to happen. But there is, I guess there's some world where it could, because it already happened once. The third one is they have a change of heart here and begin, maybe there's an injury or two and they just kind of, I'm not rooting for injuries, but sometimes playing time opens and things can kind of change and we start having a new conversation. I would love that. Maybe the timeline helps with the back and with the knees and he starts looking more like his physical self and just more like, an aggressive player on the offensive end, even if it doesn't look perfect. I don't know if any of these are like totally likely. Is Ben Simmons playing basketball in 3 years? I don't know. This is where we are. Is it crazy? It sounds crazy, but what's the end game here? That's really, I think, really, really hard to see. I think it's really hard to see what happens, and it's sad. It sucks. Like I don't know another way to put it. If you watch basketball and you've seen Ben Simmons play in the past, this really sucks. It's terrible to see. It's bad for everyone involved, right? Like it's bad. It seems bad for him. It seems bad for the Nets, the Vans, his legacy, like whatever. All of it is at its nadir right now, at its absolute low point. I don't know what ends up happening here, but I can see a world where it ends kind of like ugly, like not being around the Nets, not finishing it out. I don't think it's the likeliest outcome. I think the likeliest outcome is he becomes a role player and he plays this role and the minutes are low and we get flashes here and there. And that is kind of the story with him. And maybe that's just the way it's going to end. And maybe, like I said, a month from now, we're talking about something totally different because Ben Simmons got a new opportunity and he went back to that early season form. The reason we kind of talk about it, though, is because this is a crazy situation. If you're following the Nets and you want the Nets to do well, Ben Simmons is at the core of that. He's talented enough. He has the past history enough with it. And he is a guy that can have impact on the game. It's just not something that we've seen lately. And I'm worried that the Nets are maybe starting to make some final decisions on him going forward. Okay. We will be back after the game on Wednesday evening, and then things start to head into the All-Star break. So we'll do some cool stuff over the All-Star break. We'll be the Nets play Miami Wednesday night. When you're listening to this, we'll be post-gaming after that one, and then we'll kind of get into some of the stuff going into the All-Star game. We'll talk a little bit about maybe some stuff you can kind of look for just some of the fun stuff over All-Star weekend, and then what the second or this last third of the season for the Nets includes. Make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Really appreciate everyone that's jumped into YouTube, having a great time on YouTube, answering questions, all post-game, doing all the live stuff. Subscribe to YouTube. Make sure you hit notifications so you can get notified when we are going live. Get those subscriber numbers up. Totally free for you. That's the one way to help us. This is always the part of the podcast where I forget to get a quote like Adam always does at the end of the podcast because he's one of the great American poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.